The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, I'm the webinar organiser, Louise King. Thank you for joining today's presentation entitled Making the Transition to ISO 14001. Today's presenter is Howard Dawes, our Senior Consultant on Environmental Management at the British Safety Council. Before we get started, I'd like to explain a few housekeeping items and let you know how you can participate in today's session. You have joined today's webinar listening through your computer system by default. If you'd like to call in using the phone, just locate the audio pane and select Use Telephone. The dial-in information and access code will then be displayed. You also have the ability to ask questions using your question pane. Simply type in your question and click Send. At the end of the presentation, we will respond to your questions. If we don't have time to answer all of them, we will answer remaining questions via email after the session. Right, let's get started, and I will just transfer you over to Howard Dawes. Thank you and enjoy.
Thank you, Louise. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and good morning for those who might be listening to elsewhere, and happy lunchtime. And also, if perhaps you are listening to this on catch-up, as they say, it could be good evening, in fact. So, hello, yes, my name's Howard Dawes. I'm Senior Consultant here at British Safety Council. As Louise just said, this is a session on the recent changes and updates to ISO 14001-2015, with perhaps some a theme of also the transition to the new standard. In just preparing and thinking about this session this morning, I was just reflecting actually that transition to the new standard will be different depending on the size, the scale, where we are in the certification cycle, the sector and the resources that are available. So as I go through this session, I think my comments might be quite generic in terms of the transition process and what organisations need to think about. And so I think when you are listening to this and thinking in terms of your own organisations, just need to put that into a bit of context, because I think again, it's a generic standard. ISO 14001 is generic, relevant to all different sectors, different sizes, scales. So the transition is going to be quite different, I think, for those particular organisations. So just put the whole session into context. Okay, let's see if I can move on my screen, which doesn't seem to be working at the moment. Louise, let's see if we can do that again. Here we go. Apologies. Here we go. So hopefully you can see that now. Okay. Now, some of the key changes then in the context of ISO 14001. So, yeah, one of the main areas of the standard has been understanding the context. Has been a change in terms of trying to broaden the scope of ISO 14001. So we just need to make some reference to just hopefully give you some understanding what the context is, and there's some new requirements there for all organisations. Needs and expectations. That's needs and expectations of interested parties. Just to clarify that. So there is a requirement again, just to perhaps spend a bit more time and some careful thought and consideration in terms of who are our interested parties and what particular needs and expectations they may have, and they become what we call compliance obligations potentially within the management system. There is an enhanced requirement as well in terms of management commitment. There's always been within the standard a requirement for commitment from top management, but now within the new standard there's a specific clause to do with leadership, and that's quite I suppose an interesting development, which we'll come back to, and perhaps we'll say a few words about what we might expect our top managers to do. Risks and opportunities, just some thought about what that might be actually. There's been, I suppose there's been a tendency with ISO 14001 and environmental management to focus on negative risks or the potential impacts on the environment from a negative point of view. However, if we're developing and environmental management systems and looking at our performance, there are obviously opportunities to be gained as well. So I think again the new version is encouraging organisations to be a lot more proactive and think about the positive impacts that it might have. You're probably already aware because there's been lots of talk about it already, that within the new version of ISO 14001, there's a requirement to take a life cycle perspective when it comes to identifying how we interact and impact on the environment, the aspects and impacts, and also thinking about how we might manage those as well. So there's a bit of upstream and downstream thinking to be taken into account here. Again, broadening the scope, a much more holistic approach, I think, to environmental management. And just at the very end, just a few words about communication. Again, an enhanced requirement really. There's always been a need for communication, both internal and external, but there's a bit more of a process required. Again, proactive process in terms of thinking of what we might be required to communicate to who, how, and when. And also, I've mentioned there in the slide how some reference to reliability of that information and what does that mean. So at the end, we'll also just finalise the close the session with some next steps for organisations, and then we'll take some questions at the end as well. So that's the overall aim of today's session. So just a reminder really, those of you that might have joined us before or have heard other presentations will already be aware that the new standard follows a new revised high level structure that was developed through ISO International Standards Organization and produced in their Annex SL document. So for context, all future management system standards will follow the exact same high-level structure, which you can see there listed on the screen. Scope, normative references, terms of definitions, those are consistent across all standards. And then also, these are the main meat of the standard, I suppose you could say, is context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, improvement. All these now are consistent across all new management system standards. So ISO 9000, the quality management system that was published last September as well, follows the exact same structure. Environmental management systems, this new version of 14, follows the exact same structure. And those of you that are following the development as well of the health and safety management system, 45001, will also have the exact same structure. Reason for this is really to try, well, also it recognizes really that organizations want to try and integrate quality, health, safety, and environment. So by having the same principal requirements, clauses, that will hopefully enable that to happen. And yeah, I think for some organizations, this change in structure probably won't cause too much disruption. That said, I think those organizations that have developed an EMS to the current version 2004 and have organized it so it follows the clause of the standard, obviously that it might throw those organizations a little, and they just need to think about perhaps reorganizing depending on how they have set up and arranged their management systems. But all future standards will follow this. In specific regard to the environmental management system, there's been no reduction, no diminution, nothing's been taken out of the standard. So what was in 2004 remains in 2015. Okay, it's moved around a little bit, but the requirements are pretty much the same. However, there's been a few additional sort of elements and requirements, and a number of existing elements have been enhanced. Again, just I suppose taking into account and reflecting development since 2004. It's been 12 years since the last standard was published, and lots has happened in the world of environmental management and sustainability for that matter. So here we see on this slide here just some of the main clauses and the sub-clauses. Context of the organisation, as I mentioned, is the main overriding clause in the standard, and there are a number of sub-clauses underneath that. So understanding the organisation and its context, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, determining the scope, what comprises the EMS, etc. They see leadership and commitment. There you see policy. So policy under 2004 was 4.2, that's moved into 5.2, comes under that particular requirement there. Roles, responsibilities are in there as well. Aspects and impacts are still with us, so there's still a requirement to identify and evaluate our environmental aspects and impacts. A couple of new terms, new terminology as far as the environmental management system is concerned. Compliance obligations read that as legal and other as well, so legal and other requirements. However, again, the scope of your compliance obligations in the context of this environmental management system standard has been broadened, so that will take into account the needs and expectations of interested parties as well. We'll come back to that a bit later on. Environmental objectives and targets are in there. Support, so this is where our training, awareness, competency requirements sit, communication as well, and our documented information, document control, and finally the final sort of 3 main clauses, so your operational planning, emergency response procedures under 8, performance evaluation, so monitoring, measurement, internal audit, management review, and then finally continued improvement, the overall goal and objective for our environmental management systems. So those are the main clauses. What I'm going to do now is just focus on some of the main sort of areas, some of the main changes, and give some sort of, I suppose, interpretation that might help transition to the new standard. Okay, the first main requirement then, the first main change is, as I said already, really to broaden the scope of the environmental management system. And there's a requirement to, it says there, determine internal and external issues that are relevant to its purpose. So thinking about that, relevant to its purpose, we're in business to do certain things, whatever that purpose might be, but that could be influenced by external factors, in particular external factors. This is where I think the environmental management system, the new version, has been broadened in its scope. So the external conditions that perhaps could affect the delivery of environmental performance improvement could, for example, include a changing environment. On the slide there you see reference to climate change. Could be issues to do with biodiversity, resource depletion, water scarcity, energy scarcity in this context as well, for example. So these are external factors that we need to consider now as part of our environmental management system. It's no longer just thinking about, okay, we run a factory, we run a site, an office, and we impact, our direct impacts associated with our emissions to air, discharges to water, waste, etc. And that's how we impact on the environment. We also need to think about how the environment impacts on the business, perhaps, and climate change is probably not a bad example for that. So I just put a couple of images on the screen there just to perhaps illustrate where this is coming from. And you're probably thinking, okay, Howard, what are you going to be talking about? Okay, so on the right hand side there we see some livestock, so cattle in the UK, and this just to illustrate, I was with an organisation recently who are in the food industry, in particular the meat processing industry. Now, on the one hand, this particular organisation is pretty much ahead of the game in the sense that they appreciate, in terms of their own environmental footprint, that meat production itself has an environmental impact, and the meat industry in general is already thinking about how can they, in terms of producing that product, i.e. meat, can they reduce their own environmental impacts in terms of the intensification of meat production, water consumption, the amount of feed that they actually use and needed to actually feed the beast, as it were. So there are actually indirect environmental impacts associated with meat production. But that product itself is also at risk due to changes in climate, for example. And one of the, I hadn't really appreciated myself actually, but one of the, speaking to the people involved in this, they were so highlighting the fact that disease obviously is a concern to the industry. One particular disease that came to light fairly recently in the UK, and certainly is more prevalent in Northern Europe now, is, for example, is blue tongue. And blue tongue, whilst it impacts on other meat, sources of meat, i.e. sheep in particular, but also can affect the cattle as well. And that has the effects of potentially weakening the actual animals, and obviously that could have an impact on meat production. And in the meat processing industry, if the meat quality is affected, then you don't have a product. So this is an example where as an industry, they are concerned and will need to take into account where they get their meat from, and that could have a fundamental impact on the business. And in a wider scheme of things as well, in terms of food production, obviously climate change, water scarcity, water shortages, drought, that could impact on crops, on food products that go into that sort of food cycle, so to speak. That could impact on the price of meat, etc., etc. So there's an industry that is very aware of the potential risks associated with their products and the food production, and that's one of their external environmental issues. That provides some context for the organisation. On the left-hand side, you see another image which you may or may not recognise, just to explain. So that's you can see it looks like cactus, and you can see there's some woven baskets on there. And you're probably thinking, okay, Howard, what is this one about? So this is again another organisation I had some recent dealings with in the pharmaceutical industry, and they use colorants, pigments that go into some of their products. And one of the sources of one particular pigment is actually a naturally occurring product, actually derives from insects. And so within the industry, in terms of producing this particular pigment, they are harvesting, in effect growing with these insects, and then they are harvesting them for the purposes of producing the dyes and colorants. Now again, where these particular insects are grown, there are only 2 or 3 places in the world apparently where they are able to survive, and again they are at risk from a changing environment. So here's a business that is reliant on one particular ingredient, let's say, in terms of their products, and they have identified that also as a risk, as an external factor that could impact on them, in terms of enabling them to do what they do, might impact on their purpose relevant to its business. So this first clause in the standard context of the organisation actually does broaden the scope of the EMS. It does require some thought and some consideration in terms of what are the external issues to an organisation. And the examples there, climate change, resource scarcity, are just a couple of ways perhaps that businesses just need to take a much wider, broader view with respect to its environmental management system. And I'm sure you can think of some of the things that you are relevant to your business as well. One of the other main changes and clauses in the standard, needs and expectations. This is of interested parties. Just some context here, I suppose. Why has it been introduced? Well, now this is becoming an increasingly important function for many businesses, i.e. engagement with external parties and stakeholders, etc. So it's really become a whole function, a whole department in its own right. And within the standards, there's a need to identify the particular needs and expectations of those interested parties. Who are those interested parties, and what is it that they need to know from us, and perhaps implicitly what are their expectations? I'll come back to that in a moment. So it's not a high level, we don't need to do necessarily a high level strategic we don't need to do a detailed assessment, stakeholder analysis, but certainly perhaps an overview, a high-level strategic view of who are our stakeholder groups. Our customers obviously comes to mind immediately, the regulators, perhaps if you're operating in sensitive environments, the community. So those are some immediate stakeholders that we need to perhaps think about. So it's understanding what their particular needs are, and they may well become relevant to the business. So in terms of an approach and a process, what might this look like in practice? So we identify our interested parties, and we need to identify what their particular requirements are. Now, for some within the standard, it talks about needs and expectations. So what would a need be? Perhaps we could clarify that as being something that's actually quite specific and actually a stated requirement. So let's say, for example, there's a particular need of a regulator. You've got a compliance obligation, a permit, a trade effluent consent. So there's going to be an explicit need there to monitor and report on a regular basis, demonstrating compliance with those permit conditions. There's a specific need. An expectation, however, might not be formally stated or written down or documented or communicated. However, it has become generally accepted, let's say from a local community point of view, that you're not going to cause any disruption through, let's say, nuisance, noise, dust, whatever it might be. And so it's become custom and practice that you will avoid any negative impact on them, and they become the expectations of this particular stakeholder group. So it's just thinking about what these particular requirements might be or these particular needs. Now, these then you need to then think about, right, how relevant are these to our business? And obviously, from a regulator's point of view, they are highly relevant. Equally, so might be the expectations rather of the external stakeholders in the community. And therefore, if these are deemed to be relevant, then these will become your compliance obligations that you then have to comply with and also report on in the future. At this point, I think it's useful to also reference there are going to be some links with other parts of the standard. I think some commentary I heard recently is that lots of organisations, and I suppose I've seen this as well, lots of organisations have developed their existing environmental management system in some form of linear way. So you've got the requirements of the standard, 4.2 policy, 4.3 planning, and underneath those all those other clauses. And the management system has evolved in perhaps quite a linear sort of relationship. Within the new version of ISO 14001, there's been there are, I won't say significantly more, but certainly there are a number of areas where there are cross-linkages, links between different elements of the standard. So for example, in this particular case, obviously interested parties needs and expectations is 4.2. Which of these can become compliance obligations that actually is an explicit reference to another part of the standard, 6.13, of identifying what your compliance obligations are. And similarly, communication, we are going to have to communicate our environmental performance to relevant stakeholders. So communication 7.4, there's a particular requirement there as well. So there are links. What I'm trying to say here is there are links with other aspects of the environmental management system that we need to take into account. Similarly, and the context here is, if we're going to start communicating externally on our environmental performance to these interested parties, then that the information that we're presenting relies on accurate and transparent data and information. So our monitoring and measurement processes need to be reviewed and ensure that they are robust and consistent, ensuring we are given reliable information externally to these interested parties. And that process itself will require internal audits to take place, to checking to make sure that the monitoring measurement process is accurate and is reliable. And there's links as well to performance evaluation, choosing suitable environmental performance indicators for that external communication. So whilst 4.2 in itself is, I would say, relatively straightforward, I suppose, in terms of identifying the needs and expectations, I think we need to appreciate that there are going to be links across other parts of the environmental management system that need to be taken into account. So so whereas before perhaps we developed our EMS from a linear perspective, I think in the future we just need to be aware that there are cross-links with other parts of the environmental management system standard. Just a final comment here, just on the bottom of the slide. So hopefully that doesn't sound overly complicated. I think for most, well, I say for most organisations, a lot of organisations, I think who have already developed environmental management systems in the way that it was always intended, in terms of being proactive and communicate with relevant interested parties. I think this shouldn't cause too much of a burden. But message here would be keep it simple, keep it relevant, and in terms of identifying the needs and expectations of interested parties, I think getting others involved in the process, getting a cross-functional team, in particular, I suppose individuals within the business, I'm thinking of sales and marketing people who probably haven't been ordinarily involved perhaps in the past, but they obviously have direct relationships and direct contact with your customers, and it'd be really, really useful to get those individuals involved in terms of identifying the needs and expectations, particularly the expectations, because customers may not necessarily have anything formal written down or documented or communicated with us, but the sales and marketing team hopefully will know some of the environmental conversations that they've had and be able to communicate that to the business. Similarly, procurement, thinking about suppliers, what particular needs they might have from our own point of view, and also design team as well comes to mind in a business. So getting people involved internally, cross-functional team and workshops to develop this particular process, I think will be a useful way of transitioning to the new standard. Okay, just a brief comment on this. I'm not going to spend any time on this, but the scope clause, the final bit under clause 4 is scope, determining the scope of the environmental management system, clause 4.3, what's in and what's out. I think within the standard it talks about clarifying the physical and organisational boundary, taking into account extent of control, influence. I think the general context here is, I think there have been instances where organisations have achieved ISO 14001, but the scope of the EMS has been limited, let's say to a head office function, or perhaps the main areas where the activities take place, which is perhaps unfortunately ignoring or disregarding, let's say, satellite locations or other areas of the business that also have potential impacts on the environment, but are out of scope. They are not incorporated, they're not included. Now I think this has been recognised when ISO have and through the consultation process, they've identified this weakness, I suppose, in existing environmental management systems, and now there is a much more clear requirement to avoid that. So scoping should not be used to exclude activities, products, services that have or can have a significant environmental aspect. So hopefully that will, certainly from an environmental performance point of view, certainly benefit the environment. Obviously that's a good thing for some organisations perhaps who have up until now had a limited scope, have achieved 14,001, which is great, but have a limited scope and don't have any perhaps satellite facilities incorporated, then perhaps that will be some work that needs to be done there. Okay, next main change, and this is where, apologies for the photo, I don't know whether I should apologize, but apologies for any Welsh, Scottish, Irish, French and Italian listeners. I appreciate this gentleman isn't English either, but okay, so here's perhaps, I just wanted to find an image that is representative of leadership, and we could argue that as well, maybe separately. I just qualify this by saying I'm not a rugby connoisseur, but he just came to mind just as I was preparing this presentation this morning. But leadership, this is fundamental. It's always, again, fundamental in all management systems, health and safety as well. You need commitment and support from the very top of the organisation. It's fundamental to the success of the environmental management system. And what's happened in the new version is become a much more specific, dare I say, explicit requirement that leadership demonstrate, the top managers shall demonstrate leadership and commitment to environmental management. So that's going to, I think, present some interesting conversations internally and with any participants on this particular session. I should say also, I think it's not just perhaps individuals who are at the very top of the organisation that need to demonstrate leadership and commitment, but also perhaps heads of department, part of the senior management team in other functions. So it's not just your top man, top woman within the business, but also representatives within different functions, the heads of department also, so cross-functional commitment as well and support across the organisation. That's really important, I think, for them, and this is what the new version standard is trying to get at. So the standard actually says top management need to shall demonstrate leadership and commitment. Now, what does that mean perhaps in practice? Again, this could be debated, but I think from my point of view, I was thinking this myself. I think there are, from auditors, from my auditing experience, you can see genuine commitment from leaders who are much more visible and transparent, and they're engaged and they contribute. and when you talk to them and interview them, they actually are very genuine and understand the importance of environmental management, and they have managed to put resources in place, and they are involved, in fact, in perhaps doing audits and inspections themselves, and they do lead teams, and they are attending meetings, and they do provide the resources. So those are just a few examples perhaps of leadership in practice, and I'm sure yourselves have seen good and bad leadership in your own organisation, or not so good, should I say, not bad, not so good leadership in your own organisation when it comes to environmental management and safety and other matters. So I think this is in the new context and the new standard, they recognise the fact that leaders need to be much more engaged. It's becoming a much more explicit requirement. So under leadership, in fact, top management shall take accountability, ensure establishment of, ensure integration, communicate the importance of, directing support persons, promote continuing improvement. Now, there's, from an audit point of view, there's a lovely checklist there of what your leaders, what top management shall be doing. So if there's any evidence of them not taking responsibility, not taking accountability, are not supporting the establishment, not sort of promoting the integration, not promoting continuing environmental performance improvement, then perhaps, you know, from an audit point of view, there are some weaknesses there. So it's just a interesting observation. I suppose from a transition point of view then, and I had a very similar conversation just the other day along these lines. You know, the environmental manager at the moment is unfortunately just, well, not, I mean, they are running the environmental management system, but it's just a bit of a bolt-on, really. And when auditors come along, you know, the environmental manager is taken out of the box, answers the questions of the environmental auditor, and then put back in the box again. That sounds a bit harsh, but that's kind of like what kind of happens. And the senior management team just and the top manager just let the environmental manager type person get on with it. That's going to have to change. And so there's a cultural issue here, perhaps, that's going to be very interesting for some organisations in the future. I think, again, for some businesses, this isn't going to be a problem. The culture is very positive and pro-environment, and the leadership team is going to be already well engaged. But perhaps, I don't know, perhaps for smaller businesses where there are limited resources, and obviously there are other priorities, other issues that the senior management team are dealing with on a daily basis, then perhaps, you know, environment isn't that high on the agenda, where I think in the future it's going to have to be. So some conversations there for some businesses perhaps. Okay, moving on then. So clause 6 is a focus on risks, something called risks and opportunities. Again, I think with the new standard is trying to encourage, obviously the overall aim is to enhance improve environmental performance improvement. That's been the overall aim. And again, I think perhaps historically, environmental management systems have focused on avoiding negative impacts, you know, on the risks. But obviously there are two sides to every coin, as it were. And the flip side is where there is, you know, if we manage a risk effectively, or indeed eliminate it, then obviously there is an opportunity to be gained by doing things in a certain way. So so why has it been introduced into ISO 14001? Well, it's been introduced pure and simple because it's an explicit requirement of the management system. It's actually part of Annex SL, so it's part of quality management systems. It's will be part of also health and safety management systems 45001. So this terminology is perhaps new, risks and opportunities, but I think for most organisations, we all understand what potential risks are. Maybe the challenge is going to be that we need to think about, well, what are the opportunities to be gained as well, and think more carefully about those. So risks, you see in the slide there, risks associated with poor environmental performance, two broad categories really: operational risks, so risk of non-compliance with your legal requirements, perhaps risks also associated with inefficient processes, costing more money than perhaps it needs to or should do. Then of course there are organisational risks, so, you know, poor compliance, and if you breach consent or discharge permits, whatever, then there's going to be an impact on your business reputation. As a result of that, you could actually lose business, which might result in reduction in sales and revenue, which could also have an impact on your market share, etc., etc. So obviously there are genuine risks associated with poor environmental performance. Equally, there are significant opportunities to be gained through effective positive environmental action. So, I mean, the immediate ones that come to mind are those cost savings, reduce costs of production, but also if you think more holistically and think more proactively, you could develop products that are perhaps more energy efficient in use. And if that is obviously of interest to a potential customer, so they're looking at a product that is going to be more energy efficient for them, so which will reduce their costs, that will actually generate hopefully more interest in the product, increasing sales perhaps, which increases your market share. So obviously, so there's two sides to this environmental story here. By managing and eliminating risk, they also will generate hopefully opportunities for organisations. So I think this is where the standard is coming from, just trying to get organisations to think more holistically and think about, well, what can we and what are the potential opportunities as well. So the actual clause itself says determine, or what's the effect, determine the risks and opportunities related to its environmental aspects, compliance obligations and other issues. It's quite specific, which will lead to giving assurance the EMS will achieve its intended outcomes, will prevent or reduce the end design effects, and will achieve continual improvement. So that's a very sort of short and abridged version of what that particular requirement is. So under the standard, this is just a visual representation now. So that what the standard is asking us to do is to identify risks and opportunities associated with your environmental aspects, risks and opportunities associated with your compliance obligations, and also risks and opportunities associated with other issues and requirements. So what that will mean in practice is that when you come to do revisit your environmental aspects in terms of your transition, what it will mean is that instead of I think broadening the scope of your aspects impacts process. So I think a lot of our attention is given to risks, what are the potential negative impacts associated with what we do, but what about the positives? What if we reduce water use or start, let's say, harvesting rainwater, for example? That obviously provides an opportunity. If we start collecting rainfall, we could start reducing our water consumption. There's an opportunity. And also perhaps use the water in other areas of the business. With respect to compliance obligations, again, so what are the risks and opportunities associated with dealing with, obviously, complying with the law, but also compliance obligations could be a voluntary, those that we have signed up to on a voluntary basis with respect to our stakeholders, our interested parties. If we voluntarily adopt a particular requirement that is a requirement of an expectation of a stakeholder, that could actually lead to other opportunities in terms of perhaps an allowance, as it were, of increasing production or an expansion of the site. So there are opportunities perhaps to be gained there in identifying these risks and opportunities. So out of that process, then we need to, there's a requirement to develop these actions to address those, and these need to be documented. You can see here at the bottom of the slide, the organisation shall maintain documented information of its risks and opportunities that need to be addressed, and the process is needed to assure confidence. And that's an explicit requirement. So we shall maintain documented information on these risks and opportunities. So perhaps a little bit more work there, but I think it's just a revisit really of our aspects and impacts. I think some organisations would already be doing this, have identified opportunities. Perhaps it's not, documented as clear as it needs to be, but I think the organisations that have already adopted this approach will find this particular element not too demanding. Okay, excuse me. Okay, moving on. Clause 6, life. Under planning, there's a requirement again, as before, to identify our aspects and impacts. However, and those of us that have been following the development of ISO 14001 will already be aware probably of a new or rather enhanced requirement, which is to take a life cycle perspective. So again, why has this been introduced? What's the context? So again, I think it's because with current environmental management systems, how they've been developed and implemented, it's very much taken an operational focus, looking at what we do on site, our emissions to air, discharges to water, and waste, etc. These are things that we have direct control over, or should have direct control over. However, that fails to recognise that the environmental footprint of an organisation is much broader than just what we do on site. 75% of the footprint, typically 75% of the footprint of a business, is to do with the activities of the suppliers, so upstream, and also perhaps a product in use by the customer. And then of course the product's impacts at the end of its life, how it's disposed of and treated. So the environmental footprint of a particular organisation is much broader than just what we do within the confines of a factory gate. And this life cycle perspective aims to address that, aims to try and encourage organisations to think more holistically, more broadly around where it's getting its materials from upstream, where the resources are coming from, and also perhaps engaging again with its stakeholders, its customers, in terms of how to deal with, use a product during its use, and also how to treat it at the end of its life. Now at the moment, if I just go on to the next slide, I think, yeah, so the lifecycle perspective requires an organisation to look at their activities, products and services more holistically. The standard does not explicitly require that we undertake a life cycle assessment. Huge sigh of relief across the world there, I sense. But no, yeah, there's no requirement to carry out an LCA. However, there is a requirement to think perhaps more strategically, perhaps in terms of life cycle, and think about where our materials come from and what happens to our product at the end of its life. So just some careful thought required, and also considering the life cycle stages that we can control and or influence. And I suppose it's easiest just to illustrate this on the next slide here. So within the standard, later on actually in the standard in 8.1, which is, there are links again with operational control later on in the standard, but it does talk about life cycle stages. It does identify design and development, procurement, production, transport and delivery, use and end of life treatment and final disposal. These are the life cycle stages that are sort of identified or referred to within ISO 14001. So perhaps it's not that obvious in terms of in 6.1.2, but later on in the standard, these are the areas that we need to think about. So I've highlighted their production in terms of that life cycle, just to emphasize that a lot of our environmental management systems have been developed and implemented simply thinking about what we do on site, our production, what we have direct control over. But within our aspects impacts process, we also need to start thinking about other areas of the life cycle. And again, you can see here at the bottom of the slide, there's reference to we shall maintain documented information of this process as well. So again, that aspects impacts, I think, is going to be broadened. So yeah, we need to think about what are the environmental issues associated with our aspects impacts, but upstream it and downstream, and just linking it with another part of the management system standard, 8.1 operational control. 8.1D says we shall consider the need to provide information about potential environmental impacts associated with, and it talks about transport and delivery, use of the product, end of life treatment and disposal. So that's an interesting development. 8.1D, consider the need to provide information about potential environmental impacts associated with these sort of downstream life cycle stages of the product. And in 8.1A and B, it says, as appropriate, ensure environmental requirements are included in design and development and procurement. Now, I think that's probably where most organisations have already taking a life cycle perspective, they are already thinking about the design of the product, what material it's using, how it could be made in a way that, let's say, it could be disassembled at the end of its life, or the components reused or recycled, etc. And in procurement, you do see a lot now, purchasing managers specify the environmental performance of materials in construction, for example. Obviously, there's been a big move. It's almost a default position now where you procure sustainable resources, sustainable materials in design and build projects where you can. It's become a default, so it's almost become the norm. But for some businesses, perhaps where they haven't been, there is now an explicit requirement to, well, it says there, consider and as appropriate. Just a comment at the bottom of the slide you see there. There are these words, use of words, consider. If I just go back a slide, consider the need to provide information, and here, as appropriate, ensure environmental information requirements are included. So there is a get out there, I should say. However, because the standard says consider and as appropriate, if we don't communicate and if we don't provide information, then we would need to be able to justify why you haven't done so, why you haven't provided the information, and justify it. And the way you justify it will be through your environmental aspects and impacts process again. So interesting development there, and perhaps a bit more work required in terms of the operational control. Okay, conscious of time, just final slide here. Just don't want to dwell on this one too much because we kind of like alluded to communication already. Under clause 7 support, there's clause 7.4 say links back with 4.2 needs and expectations are interested parties, but organizations are now explicitly required to plan and implement, or the words that use shall determine a process with respect to what, how, when and who they will communicate to these stakeholders. So again, at the moment, that's an enhancement in the sense that, you know, the current standard requires for internal communication to employees and senior managers, etc. And there's a requirement, obviously, to respond to any external communication. So that could be from any interested party, whether it's a customer or a member of the public in the local community, etc., etc. But that's quite a reactive response. What the enhanced requirement is to be much more proactive in terms of communication with these interested parties, these stakeholders. We need to take into account these compliance obligations we spoke about earlier on. So if you identify and adopt a particular need and expectation from a particular stakeholder group, then it's likely that you'll be required to communicate to those on a regular basis. Obviously, if there's a compliance obligation sense of legal requirement, then there's an absolute need there. The other sort of reference to this is the information shall be, and this is the word that I've picked up myself really and thought about quite a bit, is this word reliable. The information shall be reliable. So what does that mean? Well, obviously that implies that the data information that we are providing internally and externally is obviously of use and can be relied upon to make certain decisions. And the key here is that that information needs to be accurate and transparent, is based on robust environmental monitoring measuring processes. The people collecting that data are competent. Any conversion of the data information uses up-to-date, accurate data and calculations, etc., etc. So this word reliable, actually, behind it is actually, it means quite a lot actually. That information shall be reliable to these external parties. So yeah, interesting sort of language used within the management system, something just to be aware of, I guess. Okay, and just a reference there to some guidance documentation if you're interested for communication, ISO 14001 and 63. Okay, just conscious of time, I have not addressed any particular requirements in the final clauses, clause 8, 9 and 10. Save that for another day, but hopefully identified some key changes within the new version of ISO 14001, focusing on the context of the organisation in clause 4, needs and expectations of the interested parties, leadership, what's going to be an expectation of our leaders and top management team in the future, thinking about taking a life cycle perspective as well. That will add additional, I was going to say additional work, but certainly additional thought process when identifying our aspects, impacts and compliance obligations. So some interesting developments, but also I think from my point of view, really good development of the environmental management system standard that will no doubt contribute to improved performance and sustainability as well for many organisations. So next steps, obviously if not done so already, obtain a copy of the revised standard 40001-2015 that was published last September. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but the guidance 14004 that supports the environmental management system specification has finally been published. It's published actually just earlier on this month, I think 1st of March, so it's now available as well, 14004-2016, and that will provide some interpretation of the clauses and some guidance as well for implementation. Actually, within the standard itself, 14001, there is some guidance in the back, so obviously in the annex, and that's quite useful. But I think for more detail and guidance, 14004 would also be useful. Next step, take a gap analysis. Find out what, looking at the standard the new standard and the new requirements, look at those, study those, and identify, okay, where do we need to fill any gaps in our current environmental management system? And I think I said this already, I think get others involved, get some of your colleagues, from other functions and other departments that perhaps ordinarily haven't been involved previously, but it's a good idea to get them engaged as soon as possible, because obviously they will actually be potentially involved in implementation in the future as well. So getting other functions involved will be really useful. Contact your certification body, the external third-party verification people who will obviously give advice and some guidance as well in terms of perhaps the scoping in terms of from a certification point of view, and discuss whether they can also help you from transition, as we can do ourselves, I hasten to add. But what I would say here is just to be aware that transition, there's a transition period which is in effect a 3-year window from September last year, 2015, when the standard was published. We now have until September 2018 to complete the transition to the new standard. So we've got it's a 3-year window. And where are we now? We're in March already. Crikey, March. So 6 months have gone already. So we've got 2.5 years left to go. So if you haven't started on your transition journey already, then I would strongly recommend that you start considering your transition sooner rather than later. And obviously it all depends as well where we are in the certification cycle. Speaking to some businesses recently who have just achieved recertification to 2004, they're already looking at, again, recertification probably within the next 12-18 months. 12 months, typically 12 months ahead of that 3-year window. So 2017, some organisations that I was looking at that they were already planning, and in fact just an organisation I was with this week are actually planning their recertification, which would be in May, I believe, to the new standard already. So they are ahead of the game, which is really, really good. So just be aware of that transition period. I think it's important that we start work sooner rather than later. Okay, well that's it from me. I hope that was useful. Certainly a quick whistle-stop tour over the main changes and some reference to transition. I wish everybody well in their fourth transitioning programs, etc., etc. I'm going to pause there, hand back to Louise in a moment. But if you want to email me, you can get me at howard.dawes@bridgesafe.org, or indeed you can follow me on Twitter as well at Howard Dawes, and I will close there and hand back to Louise. Over to you, Louise.
Hi Howard, thank you. That was That was excellent. We do have quite a few questions actually, which is great. The main ones are around the slides, so we can make the slides available after the presentation. The best thing to do is to email us at webinar@britsafe.org, and then I can respond with the slides. The actual live webinar will also be available. We're recording it now, so that will be on the website post the event in the events section. But also please do email the same address, webinar@britsafe.org. Okay, the other questions we have, Howard, are one is when do we have to be compliant by?
Okay, so that's reference to the recertification. So I think, if I understand the question correctly, so I just mentioned there's this 3-year transition period. So what's going to happen at those organizations that have got certification to the current version, as it were, 2004, that will automatically expire on, I think, is the date 15th of September 2018, whatever the date of the actual standard was published, it will expire in September 2018. So we have, in effect, you've got 2.5 years to go, is the short answer to that question. 2.5 years.
Great, thank you. Another question is, does the BSc offer a three-day conversion course for lead auditors, qualified people from lead auditors from 9001 or 18001? I'm not sure.
I think the short answer to that is, at the moment, probably no, but if the inquirer wants to contact us directly, we can respond to that person offline. We can certainly help in that respect.
Great, thank you. And the final question is, what level of detail is required where the standard says we need to take a life cycle perspective?
Okay, I thought that question might be asked. Well, as I said, the standard doesn't require a specific life cycle assessment. Within the standard, I'm just looking actually at the guidance as we speak. It says the just careful thought, I think, about the life cycle stages. Just starting the process and thinking in terms of life cycle will actually be a good first step, and actually could argue be a 100% improvement. So there's no specific requirement to carry out a specific life cycle assessment. It's just thinking more holistically in terms of upstream effects, potential effects, and downstream effects associated with the products perhaps in use, and thinking more holistically. So yeah, not detailed. I think it's a much more overarching strategic approach, a life cycle approach to things, I think.
Great, thank you. Okay, the final question is, when will the next webinar be held? And the answer is the 29th of June. It will be with Howard Dawes again, and Simon Colvin from Waitwins will be joining Howard. And it will be on environmental policy and legislation. It'll be an update on both. Is that correct, Howard?
That's correct. Yeah, thanks, Louis. If any participants, any listeners want any, just out of interest, any feedback in terms of other topics, other content for future webinars, do drop us a line, do drop us an email. More than happy to sort of develop our webinar sort of themes and stories, so to speak, and focus on topics that are directly of interest and concern to our members. So yeah, do drop us a line in terms of any things in particular that you want us to sort of discuss and talk about.
Great, thank you. Okay, so that's the time for the questions we have today. If you do have any more, please do email Howard or the webinar@britsafe.org address, and we can respond later on today. We hope you have a lovely afternoon, and thank you for your time, and have a great Easter. Thank you, Howard. Goodbye.
Thank you.